Autumn came to Millbrook, the way debt comes to a poor household. Quietly at first, and then all at once. And then it did not leave. The wheat had failed twice that year, once to blight and once to rain that would not stop falling. And by the time the leaves turned the color of old coins, the town had the look of a place holding its breath against a winter it could not afford. Smoke from the chimneys was thinner than it should have been. The church bell rang a little flatter, as though even brass could feel the cold coming. Along the high street, the shop windows had begun to empty themselves of the small luxuries first. Ribbon, sugar, printed cotton. The way a household sells its trinkets before it sells its furniture.
Tell me honestly, can we...
At the edge of town, where the road gave up trying to be a proper road and became a rutted lane instead, stood St. Anne's Home for Orphans, a long, low building of grey stone that had been a wool merchant's warehouse in some kinder decade, and had never quite lost the smell of raw fleece from its walls. It housed 19 children that autumn, the oldest 14, the youngest not yet weaned, and one woman who was neither its owner nor its patroness, nor, technically, its matron, but who ran it all the same because no one else had troubled to. Her name was Lynette Hale, and she wore a shawl the color of a dove's wing, a plain grey wool thing, gone soft and thin at the elbows from years of use. And she wore it now as she moved down the row of narrow beds, counting heads in the grey early light, the way a shepherd counts sheep before a storm. Lynette did not own much. She owned the shawl and a Bible with her mother's name inscribed in a hand she barely remembered, and a set of hands that had learned, out of necessity rather than instruction, how to stretch a soup bone through 4 days, and how to quiet a fevered child at 3 a.m. without waking the rest. She was 23, and looked both older and younger than that, older in the set of her mouth, and younger in the quickness of her eyes, and she was, in the town's estimation, exactly the sort of person one did not particularly notice. She preferred it that way. Noticing, in Lynette's experience, was rarely kind. The home survived on a patchwork of goodwill. A butcher who sent bones rather than throw them out, a miller who was slow to collect on what was owed, a vicar's wife who organized a subscription twice a year that brought in just enough to keep the roof from becoming a rumor rather than a fact. This year the patchwork was fraying. The miller had stopped being slow and started being firm. The subscription had brought in half of what it had the year before, because half the town's purses were as thin as the wheat had been, and beneath all of it, an current of something uglier than mere want. A mutter that moved from doorway to doorway, from the tavern to the market stalls. That someone, somewhere, must be to blame for a hunger that felt too large and too sudden to be merely bad weather. Lynette had heard the mutter without much attending to it, the way one hears wind under a door. She had matters enough of her own. A boy with a cough that would not clear, a girl of 11 who cried in her sleep and would not say why, a roof over the north room that let in rain in a long dark stain shaped, the children said, like a running horse. She had learned to triage her worries the way she triaged the soup. Largest need first, and hope the rest kept until morning. She did not know, that grey Tuesday, that the mutter had found a shape. She did not know that 2 sacks of parish grain, meant for the poorhouse and misdirected by some clerk's error to a warehouse behind the mill, had gone missing in the night, and that by the time the miller discovered the loss and raised his voice about it in the tavern, 3 men deep in their cups had already decided, with the perfect drunken logic of the desperate, that it must have been the orphans. Who else, they reasoned, had so many hungry mouths and so little to lose? Who else came and went from that low grey building with baskets under their arms, gathering scraps, gleaning what they could from bins and hedgerows, in a manner that might, to an unkind and unsteady eye, look like habitual thieving? By noon, the mutter had become a rumour, and by 2 o'clock, the rumour had grown legs and begun to walk towards St. Anne's, gathering more voices as it went, the way a small stream gathers itself into something that can move stones. Lynette was in the kitchen garden, cutting the last of the hardy cabbages before the frost took them, when she heard it coming. Not words yet, only a sound, low and many-throated. The sound a town makes when it has decided to stop being separate people and become one animal instead. She straightened, one hand still on the cabbage knife, and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather move up through her chest. She untied her apron with hands that did not shake, though she would think later that they ought to have. She went inside and gathered the children the way she had gathered them 100 times before for lesser things, a thunderstorm, a chimney fire 2 doors down, telling them in a voice pitched low and even that they were going to play a very quiet game, all of them, in the front room, and that the game required absolute stillness and absolute trust in her, and that she would tell them when it was finished. The younger ones believed her instantly, because children mostly believe the adult who does not seem afraid. The eldest, a girl named Ada with her mother's sharp eyes and none of her mother's luck, looked at Lynette a moment too long before she obeyed, and Lynette understood that Ada, at least, had heard the sound outside for what it was. Outside, the coaching road that ran past Millbrook's one respectable inn carried, that same grey afternoon, a travelling coach, bearing no crest that the town would have recognized, its owner having left the crest on the door for the season and travelled instead in a plainer conveyance, as men of consequence sometimes do when they wish to pass through a place without becoming, themselves, the event of the day. The coach had stopped at the inn to change horses, and would be gone again within the hour. Its owner had gone up to the private parlour above the yard to take a late meal, alone, as was his habit, and stood now at the window with a cup of poor coffee cooling in his hand, looking down without particular interest at the grey little town spread out below him, thinking of nothing in particular except how many more miles lay between himself and a house he was in no hurry to reach. He was not thinking of orphans. He was not thinking of grain, or mobs, or grey shawls. He had no reason yet to think of any of it. That, too, was about to change. The crowd that reached St. Anne's that afternoon numbered perhaps 40, which was not a great many people, and was, in a town the size of Millbrook, very nearly everyone with nothing better to do and something to be angry about. It had the ragged, uneven edges of a thing assembled rather than organized. Men from the tavern at its hot center, wives and idle boys drawn along its rim, a few faces that looked more frightened than furious, caught up in the current and unable, now, to step out of it without seeming to side with thieves. At its front walked the miller, red-faced and righteous, and beside him a man named Corliss, who had lost his own position at the granary that spring and had been looking, since then, for somewhere to put the injury of it. They did not so much arrive at St. Anne's as arrive upon it, the way weather arrives upon a coastline. Lynette came out to meet them on the step before they could reach the door, and she came alone, having left the children in the front room with the youngest matron's girl, a slip of 15 named Bess, who was, in that hour, considerably braver than her years. She stood on the step in her grey shawl with her hands folded before her, not because she felt calm, but because folded hands do not shake as visibly as hands left loose. And she looked down at 40 angry faces, and did not step back. "You'll not find your grain here," she said, and her voice, though it did not shout, carried the particular clarity of a person who has decided, in the space of a breath, exactly what she intends to say, and will not be moved from saying it. "There is no grain in this house beyond what feeds 19 children their supper, and you are welcome, every one of you, to search it and see for yourselves." The miller was in no state to be reasoned out of his fury by an offer of reason. 19 mouths, and no honest way to fill them," he said. "Don't tell me what a hungry child won't do in the dark, when no one's watching." "I am watching," Lynette said. "I watch them every hour of every day, and every night besides. And I tell you there is no thief among them, only children who have learned to be afraid of exactly this, of grown men deciding, because it is easier than looking further, that the smallest and least defended among us must be to blame for a hunger none of them caused. It might, on another day, have been enough. Words had turned crowds before. Linnet had seen it happen at the pulpit, and had hoped, without quite admitting she hoped it, that it might happen now. But grief and hunger together make poor listeners, and Corliss, who wanted very badly for someone to be guilty of something, chose that moment to push forward with a claim that he had seen, with his own eyes, one of the older boys near the granary 2 nights past, and the crowd, which had been listening, stopped listening, and began instead to move. It moved toward the door. Linnet did not remember afterward deciding to place herself in front of it. She remembered only that she was there, between 40 angry people and a door with 19 children behind it. Her arms spread not because she believed her arms could stop anything, but because there was nothing else in her to offer, and the ground beneath her did not seem an option worth considering. "You will not," she said, and this time her voice did break, just slightly, at the edges, though it did not stop. "You will not come into this house. Whatever you believe of me, you will not frighten children for a crime none of them committed. If you must have someone to blame, blame me. I am here. I am not hiding." Someone shouted that she was hiding them all, that very moment, behind her skirts. Someone else, one of the frightened faces near the rim, a woman Linnet recognized as a neighbor who had once brought soup when the cough went round, called out that surely this had gone far enough, and was shouted down for her trouble. The crowd swayed the way a wave sways before it breaks, undecided in the half-second before decision, and it was in that half-second, with the miller's hand actually lifted to push her aside, that a voice cut across the yard from an unexpected quarter. The parish constable, roused finally from his dinner and arriving at a dead run with 2 of the vicar's men behind him, shouting for order in the tone of a man who knows he is arriving too late to have prevented anything and is furious about it. The crowd did not disperse instantly. Crowds rarely do. But the arrival of an authority with an actual title broke something in its momentum, gave the frightened faces a reason to fall back, gave even the miller a face-saving excuse to lower his hand and mutter that he had only wanted the truth of the matter looked into, which was, after all, no more than any reasonable man would want. It thinned by degrees, muttering as it went, unsatisfied but no longer moving forward, and within a quarter hour the yard of St. Anne's held only the constable, 2 subdued vicar's men, and Linnet Hale, still standing on the step, with her arms no longer spread, but her legs, she discovered, considerably less steady than they had been a moment before. She did not cry. She had long ago decided that crying was a luxury she permitted herself only after a crisis, never during one. And even now, alone but for the constable's awkward reassurances, she held to the rule. She went inside instead, and knelt by Bess and the huddle of children in the front room, and told them, in the same low, even voice she had used an hour before, that the game was finished now, and they had played it very well indeed. Above the inn-yard, at the private parlour window, a man who had gone up for coffee and solitude had watched the entire quarter-hour unfold below him, with his cup forgotten in his hand, and grown quite cold. He had seen the crowd gather. He had seen, more particularly, the single figure who came out to meet it alone, who did not run, who stood in a plain grey shawl between 40 strangers and a door, and would not be moved from the step, though every instinct a sane person owns argues for retreat in such a moment. He had watched her arms spread. He had watched the miller's hand lift and, for one held breath, had found his own hand on the window latch, as though he meant to do something about it himself, from 2 floors up and 40 yards away. Which was absurd. And he knew it was absurd, even as his hand stayed on the latch until the constable arrived, and the crowd began, at last, to thin. He did not know her name. He did not know the children's names, or the town's particular grievance, or the true history of the missing grain. He knew only what he had seen. A woman with nothing behind her but children and a locked door, choosing, without visible hesitation, to be the thing that stood in the way. It was not the sort of thing a man forgot easily, whatever else he might otherwise have occupied his mind with on the remaining miles of a dull November road. The letter arrived 4 days later, carried not by the regular post, but by a rider in plain livery, who asked at the vicarage for directions to St. Anne's, and then presented himself at the door, with the particular stiffness of a servant unused to delivering his own master's business to the poor end of a town. He would not say who had sent him. He would only say that a reply was wanted, and that he had been instructed to wait for it, and that he had further been instructed to say the matter was one of some urgency, though not, he added, of any distress, a distinction Lynette found herself turning over for some time after he had gone. The letter itself was brief to the point of coldness, written in a hand that was clean, unhurried, and entirely without ornament, as though the writer considered flourish a form of dishonesty. It came, it said, from the office of the Earl of Ravensmore, whose estate lay some 14 miles distant along the northern road, and it stated, without preamble, that the Earl found himself in want of a governess of good character and proven steadiness for 2 children lately come under his guardianship, his late brother's son and daughter, aged 8 and 6, and that his lordship's man of business, making inquiries in the district, as such men do, had heard an account of a Miss Hale's conduct during a recent disturbance at Millbrook that recommended her, in his lordship's estimation, above the usual run of candidates. The position offered a salary Lynette read twice, to be certain she had not misread a digit, a private room, and use of the estate's carriage for such errands as her duties required. It requested her answer within the week, and closed with nothing more than a signature: J. Voss, Earl of Ravensmore, set down as plainly as a man signs a receipt. Lynette read it 3 times at the kitchen table after the children were abed. By the light of a single candle she was, in ordinary circumstances, careful not to waste. She read it a 4th time aloud to Mrs. Pruitt, the home's aged cook and nearest thing to a confidant, who listened with her arms crossed over her apron, and her opinion, as ever, arriving before Lynette had finished the sentence. "Well," said Mrs. Pruitt, "there's a salary in that letter would keep this house through 2 bad winters and not feel it. You'd be a fool to turn it down for pride's sake, and you've never yet struck me as a fool." "I did not say I meant to turn it down," Lynette said, though she had, in the privacy of her own thoughts, spent a full quarter hour doing precisely that, turning it down, turning it over, and turning it down again, before arriving, reluctantly, at the plain arithmetic of the matter. 19 children needed a roof that did not leak, and a larder that was not empty by February. 19 children did not need her particular presence so much as they needed the coin such a presence could, indirectly, secure for them. She had no family claim on St. Anne's, beyond her own insistence on staying. The home had a board of subscribers who might, with sufficient prompting and sufficient funds behind the prompting, hire a proper matron to replace her, someone with credentials Lynette had never troubled to acquire. It was, when she set sentiment aside and looked at it as she looked at the soup ledger, no contest at all. But she did not intend to go as a woman grateful merely to be chosen. She had read enough of the world, in her 23 years of being overlooked by it, to understand the difference between an offer and a rescue, and to understand that the difference mattered enormously to how a person was afterward treated in the house that made it. She wrote her reply the following morning, and it surprised the rider considerably to be handed, not the grateful acceptance he had likely been sent to collect, but a letter with terms of its own. She would accept the position, she wrote, on the condition that a portion of her salary, she named a sum, modest but exact, be paid instead directly to St. Anne's Home for Orphans on a quarterly basis, for so long as she remained in his lordship's employ, and that his lordship's man of business confirmed this arrangement in writing before she considered the matter settled. She added, because it seemed only honest to add it, that she came to the position with no formal training beyond what necessity and 19 children had taught her, and that if his lordship required credentials she did not possess, he ought to know it now rather than discover it later, to the disadvantage of the children in his care. She did not expect a swift answer. Men of consequence, in her limited experience of them, did not care to be negotiated with by governesses, however politely the negotiation was phrased. and she went to bed that night half certain she had priced herself out of the position, and made her peace, as best she could, with having tried. The reply came within 2 days, shorter even than the first letter. His lordship's man of business had reviewed the terms and found them acceptable. A document confirming the quarterly payment to St. Anne's would follow under separate seal. And as to the matter of credentials, the letter observed, with what Lynette could only interpret as the very driest note of humour she had yet encountered in a stranger's handwriting, that a woman who would stand alone before an angry crowd to protect children not her own had demonstrated, in his lordship's view, rather more of the quality required for the post than any certificate could attest to. She was expected at Ravensmoor within the fortnight. Lynette folded the letter and sat with it a long while before she told Mrs. Pruitt, and longer still before she told the children. And when she finally packed the small trunk that held the whole of her worldly goods, the Bible, 2 changes of linen, a second shawl no better than the first, she folded the original letter into its pages, not from sentiment, she told herself, but from the plain, practical wisdom of keeping proof of a bargain one meant to hold a stranger to. She did not yet know his lordship's face, or his voice, or the particular quality of his silences, which she would come, in time, to read better than she had ever imagined she would. She knew only that he had watched something happen 4 days ago that she had not known was being watched, that he had drawn from it a conclusion about her character that a great many people, having lived beside her for years, had never troubled to draw, and that whatever else awaited her at the end of 14 miles of northern road, it had already asked something rare of her. Not gratitude, but terms. She meant to hold him to them. Ravensmoor Hall did not so much come into view as accumulate, the way a fact accumulates in the mind of someone reluctant to believe it. First a wall, grey stone running long beside the road, then a gatehouse gone slightly to moss at its corners. Then, as the carriage rounded the last stand of bare elms, the house itself, wide and grave, and considerably larger than Lynette had allowed herself to imagine, its windows catching the low afternoon light in a way that made it look, for one unguarded moment, almost warm, before a cloud crossed the sun, and it went back to being simply large and grey and shut. More than half its windows, she would learn within the week, were shuttered on the inside, regardless of the light without. It was a house, she came to understand, that had decided some years before her arrival to occupy less of itself than it owned, the way a grieving person learns to occupy less of a room than they once did, keeping to its edges, closing doors behind them, out of some instinct that empty space, once acknowledged, becomes unbearable. She was received not by the Earl, but by his housekeeper, a spare, upright woman of perhaps 60, named Mrs. Hattersley, whose gaze went over Lynette once, from the crown of her plain bonnet to the hem of her second-best gown, with the swift, total assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years deciding, in a single glance, who belonged in a house and who would need watching. "You're smaller than I pictured," Miss Hattersley said, by way of greeting, "for a woman who stood down half a town." "I had very little choice in the matter of my height," Lynette said, "though I'll own I've been told the same about my nerve." Something that was not quite a smile crossed Mrs. Hattersley's face, and was gone before it could be called one. "Well, come in out of the cold then, before his lordship decides you've frozen on his doorstep and blames the household for it." The children were produced for her inspection within the hour, in the manner of goods presented for approval rather than persons introduced, which told Lynette a good deal about how the household had lately handled 2 orphaned children it did not quite know what to do with. Theo was 8, solemn, dark-haired, with his uncle's stillness already settling into his small shoulders, in a way that looked, on a child, considerably more troubling than it likely looked on a grown man. Ivy was 6, fair, and had clearly decided some months before that the safest response to a world that kept rearranging itself around her was to say as little as possible and watch everything. "You'll not get much out of either of them today," Mrs. Hattersley said, not unkindly, watching Lynette crouch to Ivy's eye level rather than lean over her. "They've had 3 governesses since the spring. 2 left of their own accord, and one his lordship dismissed inside a fortnight for calling Master Theo sullen to his face, which, whatever else you make of his lordship, you'll learn quickly enough is not a word he permits used of that child in his hearing. "I shan't call him sullen," Lynette said. "A child who has lost both his parents in 1 year has a very great deal to be quiet about, and quiet is not the same failing as sullenness, whatever a hurried woman might mistake it for." Mrs. Hattersley's eyes went over her again, differently this time. "No," she said. "It isn't." The Earl himself did not receive her until the second evening, having been from home on the day of her arrival, on business he did not trouble to name. And when she was at last shown into the small library, where he conducted what she would learn was nearly all his correspondence and most of his life, she found a man considerably younger than the gravity of his letters had led her to expect. Perhaps 35, dark, tall, dressed with a plainness that in a lesser house might have been mistaken for indifference to appearance, and here read, instead, as a kind of deliberate austerity, a refusal of ornament that matched the hand in which he wrote. He did not rise at once. He finished the line he was writing, set down his pen with exact care, and looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not, that first evening, read at all. Not coldness, precisely, but a kind of held stillness, as though he were a man accustomed to keeping every door in himself shut, and had not yet decided whether this new arrival warranted the trouble of unlocking even one. "Miss Hale," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and entirely without warmth, though she would notice later that it was also entirely without cruelty, which was not nothing. "I am told you negotiate terms with strangers before you have met them." "I am told the same of you, my lord, since it was your letter that arrived with terms of its own before I had so much as seen your face." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, not quite approval, but adjacent to both, and was gone as quickly as it had come. "The payment to St. Anne's has been confirmed under seal, as promised. You will find my household exact in its obligations, Miss Hale, whatever else you find it wanting in." "I did not come expecting warmth, my lord. I came expecting a wage and an honest bargain, and I find I have received both already, which is more than most bargains offer." "Then we understand one another," he said, and looked back down at his letter in a manner so final that she understood herself dismissed, and withdrew from the library with the distinct sense of having crossed a threshold into a house that measured itself, and everyone within it, entirely in the coin of exactness. Obligations met, terms honored, doors shut, and had long ago stopped believing that anything warmer than exactness was owed to it, or owed by it, to anyone at all. She lay awake some while that first week in the small, plain room allotted her, listening to a house too large to be entirely silent, a settling beam, a distant door, the particular hush of shuttered rooms holding their breath along an unlit corridor, and thought, before she slept, that she had come to a place very like a winter garden, not dead, precisely, but not yet decided to live, either. She did not know, that first week, whether it was hers to decide such a thing for it, but she had never yet met a room she could not eventually persuade to unshutter its windows, given time enough and a reason. And something in her, stubborn, practical, entirely unglamorous, had already begun, without quite asking her permission, to look for the reason this house might have. Lynette's conquest of Ravensmoor, such as it was, began not with the Earl, but with a window. It was the schoolroom window, on the east side of the house, which had been shuttered from within since some point before her arrival that no one troubled to date for her, and which let in, when she finally worked the stiff latch loose on her fourth morning, a wedge of cold, clean light that fell across the dusty floorboards like something almost startled to find itself indoors. Ivy, who had been sitting through her letters with the particular blankness of a child enduring rather than learning, looked up at the light as though it were an event, which, in that house, it apparently was. "Mrs. Hattersley keeps them shut for the damp," Theo said, With the careful, slightly defensive precision of a child repeating a rule he has never questioned, because questioning rules had not, in his recent experience, gone well for him. "Damp likes a shut window a good deal better than an open one," Lynette said, propping it wide with a folded ledger she found no other use for. "It's the shutting that breeds the mold, in my experience, not the letting in of a little air and light. We'll try it a week and see whose experience proves the truer." She did not ask permission of Mrs. Hattersley, reasoning, correctly as it turned out, that permission asked for in advance invited refusal, while a small change quietly made and found, after a week, to have done no harm, was far more likely to be allowed to stand. Mrs. Hattersley noticed the window within the day, said nothing beyond a long look that Lynette could not entirely read, and said nothing more about it the day after that either, which Lynette understood, correctly, as tacit permission of the only kind that house appeared willing to grant anything. It was the first of a great many small unshutterings. She could not have said, had anyone asked her to account for her method, that she possessed one beyond plain attention. The same attention she had spent years turning on 19 children, with too little and too few to give it to them, applied now to 2 children with a great deal materially, and almost nothing else. She learned that Theo, for all his careful stillness, would talk without reserve about horses, and so she asked him, daily and with real interest, about the stable's inhabitants, until his answers grew longer than his questions used to be. She learned that Ivy did not like to be asked direct questions about her feelings, which only closed her further, but would, if simply sat beside in comfortable silence long enough, occasionally offer up a small, unprompted confidence, the way a shy animal offers itself to a hand that has stopped reaching. She stopped correcting Theo's solemnity and stopped filling Ivy's silences, and within a fortnight the schoolroom had acquired, without anyone quite announcing it, the sound of 2 children who occasionally, unexpectedly, laughed. The household began to soften by similarly unannounced degrees. She befriended the cook, a broad, tired woman named Mrs. Bell, by the simple expedient of asking after her own family's welfare and remembering the answers, and befriended, in turn, the youngest housemaid, a girl scarcely older than Lynette's own eldest ward back at St. Anne's, by teaching her, in a stolen half-hour, the reading Lynette had once taught the orphans by rote in exactly this fashion. Small kindnesses, offered without display and without any apparent expectation of return, have a way of accumulating in a household, the way warmth accumulates in a room whose fire has finally been properly built up, rather than merely kept from going out. And within 2 months of her arrival, Ravensmoor's staff had begun, in the particular manner of servants who notice everything and comment on very little, to regard the new governess as something closer to an ally than an addition. The Earl himself she saw seldom, and when she saw him, briefly. He dined alone more often than not, kept to the library in the evenings, and conducted the business of the estate with a thoroughness that left, so far as Lynette could observe, almost no hours unaccounted for, and almost none, either, given over to anything that might be called ease. She learned from Mrs. Hattersley, in the sparing, sideways manner that housekeeper offered any information at all, that his lordship had lost a wife to a fever some 4 years past, in the 2nd year of their marriage, before any child had come of the match, and had lost, this past spring, the younger brother who had been, by every account, the one person able to make him laugh outright, rather than merely permit himself the almost of one. The children, his brother's children, had come to Ravensmoor in the same season as their father's death, into a house whose master was himself still learning to carry a grief he had not finished setting down, before a second one arrived to be added to it. "He is not unkind," Mrs. Hattersley said one evening, when Lynette had asked, carefully, whether his lordship's coldness toward the children was a fixed thing or merely an unpracticed one. "He is a man who has had a very great deal taken from him in a very short span of years, and who has decided, I think, that the safest thing to do with what remains to him is to hold it at some little distance, so that if it, too, should be taken, the loss will not undo him entirely. It is not the same as not caring, Miss Hale, whatever it may look like from the outside. I have kept this house long enough to know the difference, even when he does not trouble to show it. Lynette turned this over a good while, that night and several nights after, watching the Earl at the rare family dinners he now and again consented to take with the children rather than alone, watching how his eyes, when he believed no one observed him closely, would rest on Theo's bent head over his plate, or on Ivy's small, determined efforts with her fork, with an expression that was gone the instant either child looked up, replaced by the same careful, exact courtesy he extended to everyone in his house, warm to no one and cold to none. She began, without entirely deciding to watch for the moments the careful expressions slipped. She did not yet know she was doing it for any reason beyond a governess's ordinary curiosity about the master of a house in which she meant to remain some years. She would understand, later, that she had already begun the slow work of learning a man the way she had once learned a leaking roof, by watching, patiently, for exactly where the water came in. The thaw, when it came, did not announce itself with any single dramatic hour, but arrived the way most true changes arrive in a life, sideways, on an evening that had no particular reason to be different from any other, over a matter so small that Lynette would afterwards struggle to explain to anyone why it had mattered so much. Theo had taken a fall from the old grey pony in the home paddock, nothing serious. A wrenched wrist, a scraped cheek, the ordinary toll of an 8-year-old's ambitions outrunning his skill. But the boy had gone very white and very silent, in the manner of a child determined not to cry in front of a house that had already, in his short life, seen him lose a great deal more than his composure over a pony. Lynette had carried him in herself, refusing the stable boy's offer to fetch someone properly suited to the task, and had been sitting with him in the small parlour of the schoolroom, wrapping his wrist by lamplight, and talking to him in a low, steady stream about nothing at all. The pony's ridiculous opinion of carrots, the state of the west hedge, anything to keep his mind from the throb in his arm, when the door opened without a knock, and the Earl came in. He had heard of the fall from Mrs. Hattersley and come, Lynette understood at once, faster and more directly than any errand of mere obligation required. He crossed the room in 3 strides, knelt at his nephew's other side, with a haste that stripped, for one unguarded moment, every trace of his careful exactness from his face, and said, in a voice gone rough at its edges, "Are you hurt badly, Theo? Tell me the truth of it now." "It's only a wrench, sir," Theo said, with a brave attempt at his uncle's own steadiness that nearly broke Lynette's composure more than the fall itself had. "Miss Hale says it isn't broken." "It is not broken," Lynette confirmed. "He'll have a sore wrist a week or more, and no riding until Mrs. Hattersley and I are both satisfied of it, whatever his own opinion of the matter may be." The Earl's hand, she noticed, had come to rest on his nephew's shoulder, and stayed there, gripping perhaps a shade tighter than the injury alone required, and he held it there a long moment before he seemed to recollect himself, and eased it, and looked up at Lynette across the boy's bent head with an expression she had not yet seen him wear, stripped bare, for that one unguarded instant, of every wall he ordinarily kept between himself and the room. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not sending for someone else, for staying with him yourself." "I should have done the same for any child in my care, my lord." "Yes," he said, "I begin to understand that you would." He rose, and something in his face closed again by visible degrees, folding itself back into the careful courtesy she had grown used to. But not entirely, not all the way. A door left a little wider than before, even once shut. "Sit with me a moment, Miss Hale, once Theo is settled. There is a matter of the household accounts I would have your opinion on." There was, in fact, no such matter, or none that could not have waited a week, as she came to understand once Theo was tucked into bed, and she found the Earl in the library, not with the estate ledgers before him, but with 2 glasses of wine poured and untouched, and the fire built up higher than his usual frugal habit allowed. He did not immediately explain himself, and she did not press him, having learned enough of his silences by then to know that pressing, only closed what patience might, given time, open of its own accord. My brother used to fall from that same pony with monotonous regularity, he said at last, looking into the fire rather than at her. He never once cried over it either, though he was a far worse liar about being unhurt than his son is. I used to tell him he'd break his fool neck before he was 12, and he used to tell me I worried like an old woman, and we would both of us laugh about it, because it did not yet seem possible that either of us might be right. He turned the wine glass slowly by its stem, not drinking. He was right, in the end, though not about the pony. A fever took him in March, in 3 days, before I had even word he was ill enough to send for me. I have found, since, that I do not much care for watching children fall from ponies. I am sorry, Lynette said, and did not follow it with any of the ordinary consolations, having learned long ago from 19 grieving children of her own that consolation offered too quickly is often only a way of asking the grieving person to stop making the comforter uncomfortable. He looked at her then, really looked, in a way she felt land somewhere beneath her collarbone. And something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, the almost of one. You did not tell me it would pass, or that he is at peace, or any of the other things people are generally so quick to tell a man in my position. They would have been true things, my lord, most likely. But I have never yet found that true things offered at the wrong moment feel like anything but false ones. No, he said. I don't imagine they do. He was quiet a long moment, the fire settling and popping between them. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its rough edge and settled into something quieter still, more careful, as though he were setting down a weight he had carried so long he had nearly forgotten its shape. I did not expect, when I wrote offering you a position, to find myself glad of the offer for reasons beyond the children's welfare. I find that I am glad of it regardless. This house has been a good deal less shuttered since your arrival than it was before it, Miss Hale, in ways I do not think are only a matter of unlatched windows. We'll pause the story here for just a moment. If you don't want to miss what happens next, do stay with us. And please consider subscribing so that new stories find their way to you. Lynette felt the colour rise in her own face at that. Unused as she was to being noticed, that alone noticed so precisely, and covered it by reaching for her own untouched glass at last. I have only done what any sensible person does with a shut window in a cold house, my lord. Opened it, and waited to see whether the room objected. And did it? He asked. Object? Not so far, she said, as I've been able to tell. He looked at her a moment longer, the almost smile still resting at the corner of his mouth, unresolved, and did not answer that directly at all, though something in the quality of his silence told her, as clearly as any words might have, that he had not found the room's answer wanting either. Miss Camilla Denham had, for the better part of 2 years, considered the Earl of Ravensmoor a matter of settled future, rather than open question. Not an engagement, precisely. Nothing so vulgar as an understanding either party had actually voiced, but a conclusion she had arrived at privately, and had seen no particular reason to doubt, given her own beauty, her family's respectable acreage adjoining his, and the plain arithmetic of 2 eligible neighbours of similar age and similar circumstance, in a district that offered very few others of either. She was lovely in the accepted fashion, golden-haired and quick-tongued, dressed always at the leading edge of what the county considered fashionable, and had spent those 2 years being, by her own private accounting, patient. A patience she felt, by the autumn of Lynette's 2nd year at Ravensmoor, had gone considerably underappreciated. She noticed the governess before she troubled to learn her name, in the way one notices a change in furniture rearrangement before one troubles to ask who moved it. The Earl, at the Michaelmas assembly, danced with his niece's governess, a single set, entirely proper, entirely explicable by the fact that Miss Hale had accompanied the children, and someone had needed to partner her for a country dance that required even numbers. and Camilla watched it from across the room with an attention considerably more intent than the innocence of the event required, and did not like, at all, the particular ease with which his lordship, ordinarily so sparing of his conversation, appeared to be speaking to his partner throughout the whole of the set. She made inquiries, in the unhurried manner of a woman assembling ammunition rather than mere information, and learned of the grey shawl, the riot at Millbrook, the negotiated terms, the unshuttered schoolroom windows, the fortnightly reports of 2 children grown suddenly, unaccountably happier than they had been in a year, and found, in all of it, not reassurance, but every reason for alarm. A woman with no fortune and no family recommendation, who nonetheless negotiated terms with an Earl as an equal, who had made herself, in 2 short years, indispensable to a household that had resisted every other governess sent to it, was not, in Camilla's private estimation, a mere servant to be dismissed from consideration. She was a rival, who had simply not yet been recognized as one by the only person whose recognition mattered. The first attacks were small, calibrated, the sort that could be denied as mere carelessness if ever called to account. A remark at a card party, lightly delivered, about how remarkably familiar the new governess had grown with a house not her own. Surely his lordship's staff found it trying to have a woman of such uncertain origins directing the household's small comforts as though she had some claim upon them. A pointed inquiry before 3 other ladies as to whether it was quite usual for a governess to dine with the family rather than take her meals apart, as decorum and long custom generally prescribed. A comment dropped at the milliner's within easy hearing of the vicar's wife, wondering aloud whether a woman who had once stood so boldly before an angry crowd might not have rather more ambition in her than the modest post of governess could satisfy, and whether his lordship, grieving and lonely as he had been these 4 years, might not make an easy mark for exactly such ambition, dressed up prettily as devotion to his wards. Linnet heard the milder versions of these murmurs second-hand, from Mrs. Hattersley's careful, sideways reporting, and bore them with the same steadiness she had once borne the town's mutter before it found its shape at her door. She did not answer them, reasoning that answering gossip generally only fed it, and she did not carry them to the Earl, reasoning further that a man with grief enough of his own need not be burdened with the small cruelties of a woman he had, so far as Linnet could tell, never encouraged to any expectation whatsoever. But small cruelties left unanswered have a way of emboldening themselves toward larger ones, and by the following spring, Camilla Denham's murmurs had sharpened from insinuation into something closer to open accusation. At an assembly held to mark the opening of the county's new subscription library, before a room considerably fuller and considerably less discreet than any card party, Camilla remarked, loudly enough to carry, and with an expression of pained, reluctant concern calculated to suggest she raised the matter only from the deepest regard for his lordship's welfare, that she had heard, from a source she would not name, that the governess at Ravensmoor had been dismissed once already from a previous situation for conduct unbecoming, and that she wondered, only wondered, whether his lordship's household had troubled to inquire properly into Miss Hale's character before placing 2 motherless children so entirely in her care. It was not true. It was not even a claim grounded in any fact Camilla possessed, having invented it whole from the general shape of what she wished were true, but a lie told confidently, in a crowded room, before witnesses inclined to believe the worst of an unconnected woman risen so far above her expected station, does not require truth to do damage. It requires only an audience willing to repeat it. And by the time the assembly's music resumed, half the room had already begun to. Linnet, who had not been present to hear it herself, learned of it the following morning from Mrs. Hattersley's white, furious face, and felt something she had not felt since the day of the riot. Not fear, this time, but a cold, still anger, entirely without heat, of the sort that settles rather than burns. She thought of 19 children at St. Anne's who depended on her wages and her good name both. She thought of Theo and Ivy, whose happiness these 2 years had cost her a great deal of quiet, patient labor she was not prepared to see undone by a lie invented in a ballroom. And she thought, though she was careful not to dwell on the thought overlong, of a man who had told her, one fireside evening, that his house had been a good deal less shuttered since her arrival, and wondered, with a dread she would not have admitted to a single living soul, whether a lie loud enough might yet persuade him to shutter it again. The Earl heard the accusation within a day, as he was bound to, for a room does not gossip about a man's own household without the report finding its way back to him faster than any other kind of news travels. He heard it first from a neighbour who mentioned it in passing, believing it already common knowledge, and then, more fully and more furiously, from Mrs. Hattersley, who had never in 30 years of service raised her voice to him, and raised it now, recounting Camilla Denham's exact words with the precision of a woman who intended them to be answered for. He said very little upon hearing it, which Lynette, watching him across the breakfast table the following morning, with the dread she was working very hard to keep from her face, took at first for the same careful distance he extended to every difficulty that touched him too nearly. He asked her, once the children had been sent up to the schoolroom, only one question: whether the claim held any grain of truth in it whatsoever, whether there was any prior situation, any dismissal, any fact she had not disclosed to him when he engaged her. And she answered him plainly, without indignation, that there was not, that he might write to St. Anne's Board of Subscribers directly and confirm the whole of her history there, if his own judgment required more than her word for it. "I do not require confirmation of your word, Miss Hale," he said. "I required only to hear you say it, so that I might answer for it with a clear conscience, which I intend to do very publicly indeed." She did not, at the time, fully understand what he meant by it, and he did not trouble to explain further, returning instead to a silence she had learned by then not to mistake for indifference. But she understood it entirely 3 evenings later, at the county assembly held to close out the spring season, an event Camilla Denham had every reason to expect the Earl to attend, as he did most years, and every reason to believe would offer her the satisfaction of watching her rumour continue its work unchecked. He arrived that evening, with his niece's governess on his arm, which was, in itself, no great scandal. A gentleman might partner any respectable woman of his household for such an occasion, without particular comment. But he arrived, further, having sought out the assembly's host within the first quarter hour, and requested, in a manner that could not be refused, a moment's attention from the room before the dancing began. The room quieted, as rooms do for an Earl, and Camilla Denham, who had positioned herself near enough to the front to enjoy whatever small triumph she anticipated, found herself instead listening to a voice pitched low, but perfectly, unhurriedly clear, carrying to every corner of a hall gone entirely silent to hear it. "I understand," the Earl said, "that a claim has lately circulated in this room concerning the character of Miss Lynette Hale, governess to my late brother's children. I will not trouble to repeat the claim, as I understand most of you have already heard it repeated a sufficient number of times. I wish instead to state, plainly, and for the last time I intend to state it, that the claim is false in every particular, that I have confirmed as much directly with the institution in question, and that any person who continues to repeat it after this evening does so not in ignorance, but in the full knowledge of its falsehood, which I shall regard, from this point forward, as a deliberate insult to my own household and my own judgment, and shall answer accordingly." He paused, and Lynette, standing at his side with her hand very still upon his arm, felt the whole room's attention shift and settle upon her in a manner she had spent a lifetime avoiding, and found, in that moment, she did not mind at all, because of what he said next. "I have known Miss Hale 2 years," he said, "and I will tell this room plainly what manner of woman she is, since it appears some among you require the telling. She is the only person who ever stood between my nephew and his own fear of never being unafraid again, and did it not with grand gestures, but with patience, day upon day, until he laughed again in this house for the first time since his father's death. She is a woman who, faced with an angry crowd and nothing behind her but children not her own, chose to stand rather than run, and negotiated the terms of her own employment before she had so much as seen my face, because she trusted her own worth more than she trusted my good opinion of it, which I have since come to share entirely. I did not choose her for her fortune, for she has none. I did not choose her for her connections, for she has fewer still. I chose her because I have not, in 35 years, met another soul who did more good with less recognition, and asked for none of it in return. And I will not stand in a room and hear that quality slandered by anyone with less courage and considerably more leisure to invent falsehoods about their betters. He did not look at Camilla Denham as he said it, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had. The whole room understood well enough where they were aimed, and Camilla, scarlet-faced under 40 pairs of eyes that had, until 3 minutes before, been perfectly willing to repeat her invention, and were now perfectly willing to remember, forever after, the moment an Earl had called it what it was, found she had no answer that would not make the humiliation complete, and made none, and left the assembly within the half hour on the arm of a mortified aunt. Her 2 years of settled expectation ended in considerably less time than it had taken to build them. Lynette said nothing at all through the whole of it, having found, for perhaps the first time in her 23 years, that she had been seen so entirely and so publicly that speech seemed almost beside the point. It was only once the music resumed and the room's attention scattered back into its ordinary business that she trusted her own voice enough to use it. And even then it came out lower than she intended, meant for him alone. "You did not need to say all of that." "No," he agreed. "I did not need to. I wished to." He looked down at her, and the almost smile at the corner of his mouth had, for once, very nearly resolved itself into the whole of one. "I find I have grown tired of needing to hold everything I feel at some careful, exact distance, Miss Hale. It has kept me safe a very long while. I am no longer entirely certain safe is what I wish to be." They walked back to the carriage some while later, once the assembly's ordinary business had reasserted itself around them, and the two of them had ceased, for the most part, to be its principal subject. And the Earl did not immediately hand her up into it, standing instead in the cold, clear dark of the Inyard, with a stillness that was, Lynette had learned by now, not distance but its opposite, a man gathering himself toward something rather than away from it. "I have held a great many things at a distance these 4 years," he said, without preamble, watching his own breath cloud in the lamplight rather than looking directly at her, which, she had also learned, was his way of saying the things that cost him most. "My brother's death, my own grief over my wife, which I do not think I ever properly finished feeling before a second grief arrived to crowd it out. Even the children, if I am honest with you, in the first months. I held them at a distance too, from a fear I did not examine very closely, that loving them as entirely as I wished to would only give grief one more door into this house. I have been, Miss Hale, a man considerably more skilled at holding doors shut than at opening them." "I had noticed something of the kind," she said, gently enough that it might almost have been taken for teasing. "I do not think I have thanked you properly," he said, "for the windows." And when she looked at him, uncertain whether he meant it literally or otherwise, he allowed, at last, the almost smile to complete itself into something she had genuinely never yet seen on his face. Unguarded, entirely without exactness or careful distance, the smile of a man who has decided, in the space of one held breath, to stop holding a door shut that he has wanted, for a very long while, to open. Both kinds, Lynette, the schoolrooms and my own. I do not think this house had truly breathed since before my wife died, until you came into it in a grey shawl and began prying its shutters loose one at a time, without troubling to ask my leave. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it land somewhere beneath her collarbone with considerably more weight than the whole of his public defense of her character had carried, however grand and however gratefully received that defense had been. A name, offered quietly, at midnight, in an inn-yard, asked nothing of a room full of witnesses. It asked only her. "Julian," she said in answer, testing the shape of it for the first time, and watched something in his face open entirely at the sound of it. The last careful wall coming down all at once, rather than by degrees. "I do not offer you what I once offered you in a letter," he said. "Terms and a salary, and an exact accounting of obligations owed. I find I have nothing so tidy left to offer you now. I offer you only this house, breathing again because of you, and 2 children who have already given you more of their trust than they have given anyone since their parents died. And myself, such as I am, a man who has learned, rather later than he ought to have, that a bargain struck in coldness can become, if one is very fortunate, not a transaction after all, but a life. I am asking you, Lynette, to stay at Ravensmoor not as its governess, but as its mistress. If you will have a man who took 2 full years and a public scandal to work up the courage to say so plainly." She did not answer him at once, not from any hesitation as to her own feeling, which had settled itself, she realized now, some while before she had permitted herself to examine it too closely, but because the moment seemed to want, for once, to be held rather than hurried through. The cold, clear dark, his breath and hers both clouding faintly in the lamplight. The inn-yard's ordinary noise falling away to something that felt, for just those few counted seconds, entirely private. 1, 2, 3. "I came to this house," she said at last, "prepared to bargain hard for a salary and a roof that did not leak. And I find I am being offered instead a life I did not think a woman in my situation was permitted to want, let alone to be asked for so plainly. I will have you, Julian. Not for the house, and not for the wage, though I will not pretend either comes amiss to a woman who has counted soup bones for a living. I will have you because you are the first person, besides my own 2 hands, who has ever troubled to notice what I was worth, before I had proven it to a whole room of strangers first." He kissed her then, in the inn-yard, in the cold, with a thoroughness that startled the coachman into a discreet study of his own horses, and when at last they drew apart she found, to her own considerable surprise, that her eyes had gone bright with the tears she had refused herself so carefully at the riot, at the letter, at the ballroom. Refused because a crisis, in her long practice, was no time for them. And this, at last, being no crisis at all, but its very opposite, seemed exactly the moment such tears had been waiting for. She did not attempt to stop them. For the first time, in longer than she could easily reckon, she found she did not want to. A year turned, as years do, from one grey Millbrook autumn to another, though the town that Lynette returned to that November bore only a passing resemblance to the one she had left. Street. Anne's home for orphans had a new roof over its north room, the running horse stain gone at last from the plaster, and a second building besides, raised the previous spring with funds that had arrived, quarter upon quarter, from an estate 14 miles distant, and had lately been supplemented by a great deal more than the original modest sum, once its former governess became its patroness in her own right, and its master became, by marriage, the sort of man who did not do anything by half measures, once he had decided a thing was worth doing at all. Ravensmoor itself had changed more than the town had. Every window Lynette had once found shuttered stood open now to whatever light the season offered. The long table in the dining room had been shortened by half its length at her quiet insistence, so that a family of 4 did not have to shout the length of a banquet hall to pass the salt. And the library's shelves had been joined by a second set, in what had once been an unused morning room, given over now to a small but growing collection of books Theo had begun, with his uncle's careful encouragement, to actually choose for himself, rather than merely endure. Ivy had taken, that year, to keeping a small garden of her own beneath the schoolroom's east window, the same window, unshuttered on Linnet's fourth morning in the house, that had let in the first wedge of cold, clean light Ravensmore had seen in longer than anyone in it could readily recall. Julian had grown, in that year, into the particular unguarded ease of a man who no longer needed to hold every door in himself shut against the possibility of further loss. Though Mrs. Hattersley would tell anyone who asked that his lordship had always had it in him, somewhere beneath the careful exactness, and had only ever wanted a reason sufficient to let it out. He still kept, in his private ledger, a note of every obligation the estate owed, and met each one with the same precision he always had. But he had learned, that year, to keep alongside it a second accounting entirely his own, of small warmths given and received that owed nothing to any bargain, and required no repayment beyond the giving of them. Linnet stood that November morning, at the same schoolroom window she had first pried open on her fourth day at Ravensmore, watching Theo lead his small sister across the frosted lawn toward the stable, on legs grown considerably surer since his wrist had healed, a grey wool shawl, not the original, worn thin at last, and retired now to a drawer she could not quite bring herself to give away, but a second one, finer, given her by Julian on their wedding day, in the exact plain grey she had always favoured, because he had told her, quite simply, that he had no wish to see her become someone else entirely, only to see her known at last for who she had always been. She watched the children reach the stable door, watched Julian come out to meet them from wherever his morning's business had taken him, watched him lift Ivy onto his shoulders with the same unguarded ease he now brought to 100 small moments a day that had once, not so very long ago, cost him a visible effort to permit himself. She thought, watching them, of a grey Tuesday not so many autumns past, of 40 angry voices and a locked door, and a woman who had stood on a step with nothing behind her but children not her own, and no earthly reason to believe anyone was watching at all. She had not known, that afternoon, that she was seen. She knew it now, entirely, in every unshuttered window of the house around her, and every unguarded smile the man crossing the lawn no longer troubled to hide. It had not been a transaction, in the end, whatever cold terms had first brought her 14 miles up a northern road to a house that did not yet know how to breathe. It had become, instead, exactly what he had promised her in an innyard a year before, and what she had not quite dared to hope for in all her 23 years of being overlooked by everyone but the children in her own quiet care. It had become a life. Thank you so much for staying with us to the very end of this story. We would love to know which city you're listening from and what this story made you feel. Do leave us a comment and let us know. And if you don't want to miss the next story, please subscribe to the channel so it finds its way to you.